The Strangers Chapter 1 is supposed to be the first in a trilogy of movies that's set to take place in the Strangers universe, and it's directed by Renny Harlin. He was the director behind Die Hard 2, Deep Blue Sea, some other movies, so he does have the capability of making fun movies. And just as a preference, I'm one of the people who absolutely loved the Strangers movies. I mean, I know over time it's kind of garnered a reputation as a pretty divisive movie. You either love that movie or hate that movie. I'm one of the people it absolutely works for. I love this movie. It's always been one of my favorite original horror movies, so I was really interested to see how this trilogy is going to tackle it, add something new to the franchise. But for anyone who may be unfamiliar with The Strangers as a franchise, and this movie in particular, what it's about, so you have these masked invaders. They do home invasions in people's houses, trailer parks, wherever they can find people. And the thing to this movie was always that the killers kind of had no purpose for what they were doing. They're called the Strangers for a reason. They really have no rhyme or reason. They just like terrorizing people, and it was supposed to make it extremely realistic. So this movie and the first movie share a lot of similarities. And in order to kind of discuss this movie, I kind of have to contrast it to the original movie and how they did it in order to describe what I like and dislike about this movie. But I will avoid spoilers, so I'm kind of going to tiptoe on eggshells with how I do that in this review. So what you have in this movie to its core is you have a traditional home invasion movie, and what you have is you have this couple. They're traveling across the country on a 500-mile road trip. They stop at a diner, have some car troubles, so they need a place to stay for the night. They rent an Airbnb in the woods. It's the only one nearby. They're kind of in the middle of no man's land. Because of that, they're eventually going to be home invaded by the Strangers, so you have another entry to the genre. So I've always been the type of person, as much as I like the original Strangers, who kind of at the same time wondered like why it was so effective. You know, it's just a traditional home invasion movie, takes place in a cabin in the woods for these two strangers. They don't know who's invading them. And I kind of never really understood, but this movie's failings kind of helped me to understand that. And because The Strangers Chapter 1 was just a giant failure overall for the most part, I'll get the few positives out of the way really quick because there's not very many. And getting to the acting of this movie, it stars Madelaine Petsch, and I don't really know a whole lot about her at all, except for the fact she was in Riverdale for a small amount of time. Wasn't super into that show, and I mean, she's okay in this movie. This movie's weird because I couldn't tell if she was a good or bad actor because the script is so bad, but for the most part, I think she was pretty passable, pretty decent actor. As for the boyfriend, on the other hand, I think he was about as stiff as a board. I mean, call that guy Plank from Ed, Edd n Eddy, but this guy had no emotional expression at all. Didn't really buy them as a couple at all, but her specifically, I think she did a pretty decent job. And the only other positive of this movie, I would say, is the way it looks. I mean, some people will be a big fan of this aesthetic. It's kind of like a gloomy, shadowy, foggy forest that you take the majority of the movie in. I think it cinematically looks pretty good. Doesn't really work for me, you know, thematically, but I think it looked good on the eyes, so I'll give it a positive. But to me, basically everything else in this movie is complete and utter garbage, and that's because you kind of have a movie that it's a shell of itself. It doesn't really know what it is. It's missing the plot. It's the typical Hollywood remake thing where they remake a movie without really understanding why the original works so well. It kind of felt to me like they gave the script over to a director. He read it, thought it was really good, so he thought he would remake it without understanding any of the essence of why the original was so good. It's like ChatGPT writing. Because this movie has no originality to it, it just decides to fill in the blanks from the first one that were just basically purposely left blank to give that movie an impact. So it's kind of like self-defeating in the purpose of the movie to begin with. And while this movie does choose to be scene for the original, they just redid every scene that was like an iconic scene in the original, just significantly worse. I mean, every single thing they did that was like a twist or it was kind of like a super tense moment, they did it in like a super shitty way that was like unfulfilling, and it just left me instantly thinking in my head how much better the original did it, which didn't help this movie's cause at all. The first major negative I have with this movie is that for the first 20-30 minutes of this movie, it's legitimately just a rom-com, and it's not like an interesting, it's so bad, it's good rom-com, just an absolutely flat-out terrible one where you're following this couple around, they have no chemistry at all, bored shitless, and you're kind of waiting and there's really nothing to break the tension of the movie, keep you invested, so you're already kind of zoning out by the 20-30 minute mark. And while you, the viewer, are dredging through the first 20-30 minutes of this movie, I mean, one of the biggest red flags you're going to notice within like 5 minutes of this movie is how bad the dialogue is. Again, this is a year of terrible, lazy dialogue, but in this movie, like, one of the plot points or the talking points they're kind of talking about for the first 10 minutes of this movie is how the main character's a vegetarian, and they stop at this diner in this small town, and every character is making a big deal about the fact she's a vegetarian. It's like, it's 2024, man. Like, you're in Portland, Oregon. It's like a liberal state. Like, I don't understand how this is like a confrontation point. We're supposed to draw attention from the fact the main character is a vegetarian. Stupid and lazy. And when you do get past that, this movie is really just a hodgepodge of like all of the worst elements of horror put together. I mean, it's like a Scooby-Doo sandwich-sized stack of cliches that are absolutely played out at this point. You have people tripping over their feet, bad phone reception, people who can't find their phone, people not picking up their phone when they are called, a main character with asthma, that one's catching on a lot. And don't forget the biggest trope in all of horror movies, where you have a character who finds a gun, but he just refuses to use it on people who only have knives. And this movie definitely felt like a PG-13 horror movie for a lot of reasons, because as I said, it's a pretty traditional movie at its core. It's going to be a home invasion at some point when you get there, but everything leading up to it just needs to kind of like, you know, cut the runtime in half. So You have a ton of jump scares that come out of absolutely nowhere. It's like people at a diner jumping in front of a window. It's stupid shit like that to kind of keep you invested, but none of the jump scares work. And at its core, honestly, the main issue I take with jump scares in a movie like this is if you know how the movies end, if you've seen the original movies, the jump scares and like the red herrings of all the weird characters you're going to encounter and things like that, they don't matter because you know what the movie's going to inevitably be. So every time they introduce like a shady mechanic, a creepy guy in a diner, you know that they don't matter because you know what The Strangers is all about. So they're essentially like wasting your time with red herrings and jump scares that don't mean shit, and you know they don't. So I talked a little bit earlier about the way this movie looks as like a positive, and I think it does look good visually, like the color on your eyes. But everything else, in my opinion, the person who directed or who did the cinematography for this movie did not understand at all what made the original movie tense. And what I mean by that is like the way they chose to film this movie. Every shot they use is kind of like a long overexposed shot, and it's like a direct shot of a character where you can see the entire room, you can see the character's reaction, you can see if something's behind them. There's no tension at all. And what the original movie of this did so well is it really worked on a small scale of feeling super claustrophobic and atmospheric, that a person was in like a cabin, they didn't know if something was outside. And this movie takes the contrary approach where they show you the killers way too much. And that's something I actually have a problem with this franchise going forward and ahead in the second one as well. And to elaborate on that, what I mean is that this movie really has no idea how to build tension with the premise, because what they do is they overexpose you to the killers so much, you kind of always know where they're at, so there's no tension at all of like where they could jump up. Because what they'll do is they'll show you a character, like they'll be crying in a corner or something, and then they'll show you the killer walking down the hallway with a knife. And then they'll show you a character trying to walk out the front door, and you'll have the killer right behind them. So again, it completely misses the plot because you're constantly able to keep up with where every single character is. It makes it like not tense or atmospheric at all. And this movie actually confirmed to me what made the original movie so special to me, and that's the scale of the movie. What I mean by that is in the original movie, you have these two characters, they show up to a cabin, and they're kind of like isolated in the cabin. You don't encounter anybody else really for the majority of the movie. They're stuck in the woods. It's a sense of isolationism. You really don't know where anybody's going to be coming from. And for that reason, every second of screen time, you're thinking, are they in the cabin? Are they outside the cabin? You don't see them too often. Just dread all over. And what this movie chooses to do, even right off the bat, they stop at a diner. You're introduced to about 10 to 15 extra characters. And to me, that really hurts this movie because it makes the scale of the movie way too big. Like you're already outside of the cabin's an afterthought. And for this movie to work, you really need to narrow it down very, very small into just a cabin where you have that dread of like, they don't know anybody else. They don't know where they're at. They don't know if the killers are outside, if they're inside. They show you everything directly in this movie. And because they choose to do it like that, you're just left with a boring mess of a movie because the premise is so inherently simple. But if it's not tense, you just don't care. And getting back to the scale, there's always three killers in these movies. There's a guy with a bag on his head, and there's these two girls with masks. And much like Prey at Night, I feel like this movie was way too obsessed with the guy with the bag on his head who has the axe. I mean, he's like the only guy who gets screen time in this movie, and he just teleports around to the point my theater was laughing. I mean, you have three killers, and if you always only show one of them, it just removes the scale at all that the other guys even matter. They're just afterthoughts. You don't care about them. And as for a couple of honorable mentions for things I thought were pretty stupid and took me out of it, I felt like this movie didn't know how to edit or cut out stuff in the movie. Like, there's scenes in this movie related to music and like a piano, and like, it was kind of interesting the first time, but they went back to the well like 4 or 5 times. They played the exact same scene and showed you the same things with the killers. And it was like, did you guys like forget to edit this out? It was the same scene you showed me 3 times. One of the dumber things in this movie, because there's no real character development because you barely even know this couple, is they're obviously a physical touch couple because every scene, no matter what happens, they instantly hug each other. Like there's a scene where a guy gets shot and then instantly he just drops the gun and he just hugs his girlfriend. It's like, you're in the middle of a life or death scenario, buddy. It's not time for romance. I don't know. This movie really was just an exercise in like the nuance of filmmaking to me. You have 2 movies, the original and this, where you have like essentially the same premise, 95% of the premise. And like one just absolutely works on all levels and one doesn't work on any level. I just feel like this movie can only go down 2 ways. If you love the original Strangers, you're probably going to hate this movie. And if you hated the original Strangers, you're probably going to hate this movie even more if you didn't like that movie. The main thought I had in my head watching this movie was, why did this movie get made? Avoid this movie like Stranger Danger. It's dog shit. So obviously this is part of a trilogy, and like who knows how they're going to conclude this, how they're going to add on to this and build on this. Who knows whatsoever, but it's kind of like a bad car wreck. I'm like kind of interested to look at it, but after this movie, I have absolutely like no faith the direction of the movie, the director, they're going to pull this off whatsoever. I don't know. This is just becoming one of those horror movie franchises that's entering like limbo for me. I don't think it knows what it wants to be. I don't really like the direction it's taking. I really liked the original. Wasn't crazy about the second one. This one's significantly worse. So if you've seen the original Strangers, comment down below, let me know. If you haven't subscribed yet, what the hell are you waiting for? As always, more videos to come, but that's all I got in this video. Peace.